I hope you're okay, and welcome back to the second episode of this introductory lecture to human embryology. And today we are going to tackle some few basic things. That is the reproductive cycle, where we'll tackle the ovarian cycle, what happens in the ovary in preparation for fertilization, and also the menstrual cycle. And later after that, we'll still also talk about fertilization itself. Today, we are going to have life beginning now. But maybe just before that, we have a brief recap of what we discussed in the previous lecture, the first episode of this particular topic. And you remember we discussed about the basis of reproduction being cell division, and where we had two types of processes involved in cell division. We had one mitosis and two meiosis. And then we went ahead to see how these processes take place and where each one of them takes place, where we found mitosis takes place in the somatic cells or the body cells, while meiosis is a process that it is aimed at producing the sex cells or gametes, and it takes place in the gonads or in the germ cells. We found out that also mitosis gives rise to two daughter cells, and meiosis usually gives rise to four daughter cells, which are actually haploid, unlike in mitosis where the cells are diploid. And we also realized that why we need haploid cells in meiosis or in gametes is because a gamete is going to fuse with another gamete, from one from the father and one from the mother, and when they fuse, there's going to be recombination of the chromosomes, and therefore you get 23 from the father and 23 from the mother, and therefore you resume the diploid status, which is normal for human beings. So that was the cell division, and then we went ahead to look at the process of gametogenesis, where we said this is the process by which sex cells or gametes are formed. And we saw in females we call it oogenesis, and in males we call it spermatocytogenesis. So we saw how the processes take place, and we found out that in males it's just a straightforward process which begins at puberty, beginning with the oogonia that divide to form the primary spermatocyte, which undergoes meiosis 1 to give rise to the secondary spermatocyte, which then divides again to give us spermatids. And these spermatids are just naive cells. They do not have the capacity to swim. They do not have the capacity to be able to fertilize an ovum, and therefore they need to undergo a process of cell specialization, what we call spermiogenesis, and that is where they get specialized to acquire the responsible structures and adaptations to make them able to swim and find the ovum and to be able to fertilize it. And then we also looked at what happens in oogenesis, and we saw that it is a process that it is not as continuous as what happens in spermatogenesis. It is a process that is interrupted. So it begins right when the girl is in her mother's womb, around from 3 weeks, 5 weeks, she already has the primary oogonia, or that is the primary oocytes, and then they get arrested in prophase of metaphase 1, in prophase of meiosis 1, and then when she is at puberty, they get recruited and are allowed to proceed. And then again, they get arrested at metaphase of meiosis 2. Doesn't happen until or the process doesn't complete, that is the division, doesn't complete until fertilization takes place. We also saw that the division in oogenesis is not equal. We've got an equal cytoplasm division, and therefore, instead of us ending up with two daughter cells after meiosis one, we actually end up with one dominant, that is primary oocyte with a polar body which has received literally none of the cytoplasm, and therefore is not viable. It will just degenerate. And then when the primary oocyte also divides, it will still give us a secondary oocyte which is going to be fertilized, and then another polar body. So that is why we discussed yesterday and said it is the basic reason why ladies actually give birth to one or a singleton instead of the many that we would expect if this process was just to go on the way we know it's supposed to go on. And then we went ahead to discuss some bases of formation of abnormal gametes, and we saw where you have non-disjunction and chromosomes move to one side of, instead of them separating to different daughter cells. And we saw there you can come up with the issues of that is triploid, or the trisomies and monosomies. And we also discussed on the issue of other causes of abnormalities where you have gene mutations. It can be deletion, it can be translocation, it can be duplication of genetic material. So that is what we discussed yesterday. I hope you remember that, and there is, of course, much more that we talked about yesterday. This was just a recap. So today, this is where we are. Reproductive cycle. And this is really interesting because we're talking about things that we know they happen, but we are going to get more insight to how do they happen, why do they happen the way they happen, and what is the relevance? Where can we apply this particular knowledge? So welcome, get tuned in, and I hope we all enjoy learning this particular subtopic. So the first thing will be to ask ourselves, what is reproductive cycle? And simple definition. Anywhere you see a cycle, it means something that is repetitive. Yeah. So these are cyclic changes that usually take place in the body of a female human being, not a male. A male doesn't have a cycle, so to say. But in females, of course, it is common knowledge to all of us that when a girl reaches puberty, they are going to have menstrual periods, like every 28 days, roughly. So every 28 days, the process repeats itself. So that is what we call a cycle. Now, the reproductive cycle is divided into two. That is, we have an ovarian cycle, simply what happens in the ovary. There are cyclic changes that take place in the ovary. And also we have the menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle is simply what happens within the uterus. So there are cyclic changes within the uterus that we are going to talk about. Now, all these cycles, the two cycles that is, they are actually controlled by hormones. And these hormones, they are produced, they come from the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and also the ovary. So we are going to go to one cycle and then look at another and then bring these two cycles together and see their relationship. So let's start over with the ovarian cycle. And it's simple, like we said, the cyclic changes that take place within the ovary. And the main aim here, within the ovary, what happens is simply preparing an ovum for fertilization and pregnancy. That is the basic aim of the ovarian cycle. Remember, the whole reproductive cycle is all about preparation for reproduction. So every kind of 28 days, the body of a female human being prepares to make and carry a fetus. That is what it is. Now, in the ovary, we are going to have preparation of an ovum so that it can be fertilized and pregnancy takes place. While in the uterus is where the baby is going to grow for 9 months before it is born. So the uterus also has to prepare for pregnancy like every 28 days. If it doesn't happen right now, then it prepares for a subsequent one. If it doesn't happen, it prepares again. Cyclic, like that. It doesn't tire. So we are in the ovary now, and remember we said here we are going to have, it is an ovum being prepared, released for fertilization. So what happens? We are going to have, this process takes place in 3 phases. We've got the follicular phase, ovulation phase, and luteal phase. Don't get worried with these terms. We are going to go down each in detail so that you can be able to understand. But I think the second phase is kind of common knowledge to all of us, ovulation. Heard of it? Let's see what happens. Now, this is the ovary. If you look at this, this is the ovary. Well, it is a diagrammatic representation. So you're going to have follicles. Remember we talked about follicles in the previous lecture, where we said in a follicle, one follicle usually is composed of many cells around one oocyte. So during the first phase or the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, you are going to have these follicles start growing, and usually around 5 to 12 follicles are recruited and allowed to proceed. Here we mean they are allowed to complete their first meiotic division, that is the oocyte, and also their surrounding cells start growing. Like you can see here, we've got this follicle which started growing. We had these primary follicles here, and now this one has been allowed to grow. So like 5 to 12 of these are allowed to start proliferating. To proliferate is to grow. So now these follicles start growing and they get bigger in size, and of course after division has taken place, it becomes what we call a secondary follicle, and you find some cavities start appearing, of course, and then it becomes fluid filled. And when you get here, you come up with, you find the cells which were around the follicle here. When this cavity appeared, the cells were pushed to the side, and just a few remained surrounding the oocyte. Now, these cells which were left surrounding the oocyte, they formed what we call the cumulus euphoricus. And this is the antrum, which is fluid filled. And then now, when this follicle reaches here, then we call it, we say it has matured and it is ready now for ovulation. It is ready for release from the ovary. It has grown big enough. The egg is ready. So when it has matured and it looks like this, then we call this a Graethian follicle or a mature vesicular follicle. So this whole process where the primary follicles are recruited and then they grow until they reach maturity. We call this follicular phase, and it takes around the first 2 weeks of the cycle. So when it gets here, it has matured. So this process happens under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, which comes from the pituitary gland. We'll talk more in details about the hormones later. Now, around the 14th day, that is for a normal cycle of 28 days, an average of 28 days. Around the 14th day, then you have that follicle now comes to the surface of the ovary, and then it bursts and releases the ovum. Now, when the ovum is released, remember there were these cells here around it. So some of the cells go with it and stick around the ovum. And we call these cells the corona radiata. So once the ovum has been released, now it is fertilization to take place. It is going to remain alive for approximately 24 to 48 hours. So within this period of time, then you can have fertilization taking place, and now the lady can be able to conceive. So the bursting and release of the oocyte from the Gryphian follicle is what we call ovulation. Now, after ovulation takes place, then you can see, of course, we had a whole Gryphian follicle here. Now, this ovum, it is this one here which has been released. So what is remaining? We still remain with a structure here. Now, when this structure that remains usually is going to get blood supply, and then it forms what we call the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum has a very vital role still. What it does is it produces progesterone that is going to prepare the uterus for pregnancy, and that is prepare the uterus for pregnancy, and if it happens, then it also maintains the pregnancy. So the corpus luteum is going to remain in the ovary and continue secreting progesterone hormone for the next 14 days. Now, this phase, when this corpus luteum is remaining in the ovary and secreting progesterone, that is after ovulation, then this phase we call it the luteal phase. Remember, from corpus luteum, then it becomes the luteal phase because it is the corpus luteum that controls this particular section of the ovarian cycle. So from ovulation to the time the corpus luteum starts degrading, it takes around 14 days, time which will be enough for fertilization to have taken place and also implantation. When fertilization has taken place and implantation has occurred, then a hormone is going to be released, the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, that is going to stimulate this corpus luteum to continue secreting the hormones instead of it dying off. So basically that is it about the ovarian cycle. Maybe just some few more things to note is that during the follicular phase, as these follicles grow, one other thing they do is they secrete estrogen hormone. And we all know the role of estrogen hormone. What is going to do? The estrogen hormone is going to cause healing and growth of the inner lining of the uterus. We call it the endometrium. So it's going to be responsible for the proliferative phase of the menstrual cycle. Proliferative or proliferation, I say it is to grow. So during the first 14 days, you've got release of a lot of estrogen hormone. Then after ovulation here, ovulation is triggered by the luteinizing hormone that also comes from the pituitary gland. And then after that, you've got the remnants of the Graafian follicle, which we call the corpus luteum, which now continues secreting progesterone hormone for the next 14 days. And if pregnancy doesn't take place, then this corpus luteum starts disintegrating, and we remain with just a scar tissue, what we call the corpus albicans. So now let's talk about the menstrual cycle. And we say the menstrual cycle, simply this is the cyclic changes that takes place in the endometrium. Endo means inside, the metrium refers to the uterus. So the cyclic changes that take place on the inner lining of the uterus, that is what we call the menstrual cycle. And it has also three phases. We've got the menstrual phase that we commonly refer to as periods. And then it has got the proliferative phase. This is a phase when, you see, during the menstrual phase, actually what is happening is the uterus, the wall of the uterus, usually sheds off because it had grown to prepare for pregnancy.